All right, Jim Wiinanen is going to talk about Seagull Lake. Jim, thank you for being here and for sharing with us today.
Hello, thanks for having me. Seagull Lake is, I call it kind of a people-sized lake because Sag is more a God-sized lake. There was a little discussion about a bio for introduction. Bonnie asked me to jot down a few things, so I gave her the list. It got posted. People saw that, and so did my grandson. My grandson looked at it and told his mom, geez, Grandpa couldn't hold a job, could he? But let's start. Big thank yous to Sandy Scrine for use of pictures, Bill Douglas, Bruce Kerput for their research on Blankenberg, and there's more to that story. That would be a good one to tell. Janet Webster in '97 had an original work she called Kayashkans, where she interviewed Seagull Lake pioneers. And then the Gunflint Trail Historical Society board membership. You're doing a great job. Really appreciate that. Before going any further, I'd like to introduce the idea of a land acknowledgement statement. These are becoming more and more relevant in Minnesota for sure, and across the country, and also Canada, where groups of people are recognizing that indigenous folks were here first.
Sorry about that.
Does this still work?
Yep.
Okay.
They're seeing a bigger picture at home.
Oh, okay. I'd like to read my land acknowledgement statement. That would be the next. I acknowledge that I live and travel in an area located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. This is land that was cared for and called home by the Anishinaabe people and the Dakota people before them from time immemorial. Ceded by the Anishinaabe in an 1854 treaty, this land holds great historical, spiritual, and personal significance for its original stewards, the Native nations and peoples of this region. I recognize and continually support and advocate for the sovereignty of the Native nations in this territory and beyond. By offering this land acknowledgement, I affirm tribal sovereignty and will work to be accountable to American Indian peoples and nations. So that's my land acknowledgement statement. Okay, here's the dry stuff for Seagull Lake. Almost 4,000 acres, almost 75 miles of shoreline, and 145 feet deep. At least 16 species of fish have been found. The littoral area, that 927 acres, that's the area from the shore to about 15 foot deep. That's where all the plants and nutrients are for plant life. Another picture of the traditional lands are acknowledging the Native Americans being here first. It actually goes back even before Anishinaabe and Dakota people. There's a whole history being uncovered by archaeology. And next. And from Seagull Lake, these are just a small part of what's been found. We can recognize an arrowhead for sure, but then there's other pieces that to the trained eye are not just plain rocks, but rocks that have been flaked on both sides, creating a tool for use, either cutting or scraping and the like. Then we can kind of jump ahead a little bit. 1700 to the 1820s. This is probably the story that many of us think of when we think of the boundary waters and canoe country and the like, is the fur trade and the push for wealth happening through that period. With Seagull Lake kind of close to the middle, Grand Portage being the hub or the rendezvous for at least the Northwest Company's fur trade. And then we talked about the Treaty of La Pointe, 1854, where these lands have been turned over to the federal government, and the government made all kinds of promises to the Native peoples. They established 2 reservations, and that agreement was signed by 87 tribal representatives. So that kind of moves us a little closer. So now the federal government has the land, and being Europeans, how do I know what's mine and what's yours? You need to get them surveyed. So that brings us into the public land survey system. Right after the lands were ceded, surveys started first up the North Shore to get it laid out, and eventually up to up here, our area, Seagull Lake, surveyed 1877 to about 1900. And that's a wonderful story too on what that was like doing that. And I also want to remember, kind of as we go through this, that Seagull Lake didn't just live in a vacuum, even though it's kind of the end of the, well, it's not the end of the world, but you can see it from there. World events, weather, government regulations, the World War, Armistice, State Blizzard, the road network expansion, all the rules for Superior National Forest, boundary waters, the automobile, the CCC program, all of that tends to color and influence and the story of Seagull Lake. Okay. So today I want to focus on kind of the area down that's now inside the boundary waters, and believe it's really a great story too. The rest of it that's outside the boundary waters, but we'll focus down on that part of the lake. Okay. So 1870s travel route from Bill Raff's book, kind of going up Hungry Jack area was the trail. I really want to emphasize when we think of the road or we talk about trails, it's easy for our mind to go out to this chunk of asphalt. We've got to think back to how it all started as footpaths and maybe some gravel at some point, and just the whole process and progression of getting to where we're at. So his map talks about a trail heading off to the west. Okay, next. And so by the 1920s, the road was somewhat passable up to Hungry Jack. And in that period, Russell Blankenberg is on the scene, coming from Wisconsin, having a resort with his mom down there, realizing that his customers were coming to this area and he wanted to get a resort on Gunflint Lake. He knew that the road was going to be extended and developed. So he started Gunflint Lodge in 1924. And then by 1928, he had started Seagull Resort. Jimmy Dunn had come to the trail in 1913. He found land to purchase down at the end of Seagull they purchased and started his resort in 29. So Russell starts, the road comes up. I don't know if it's by chance or just Russell's touch. He acquired the property with the big sand beach and also where the road ended or the public access then to Seagull. Okay. Jimmy Dunn develops his resort. Oh, this is a photo from Sandy's Grind. This is the boathouse down in the bay at the end of the lake there. You can see it's in kind of rough shape. The floor is curved, it's right over the water, kind of some questionable logs and so forth. But that was kind of the early, like 28, 29, okay. Then 31, Sue and Andy Mayo begin Wildwood Resort. Sue and Andy Mayo is, that's the big story. There's a backstory to that. Sue was married to a Bauman, and Sue isn't her real name, but that's a story for another time. Mm-hmm. So in 31, they begin Wildwood, but then Russell finds out that his guests are wanting to fish up on Sag. So they're dragging his brand new boats and so forth over the portage. And they're coming back in not very good shape. So he and Nunstead decide to build their private road up to Sag, where Russell would start Sag Fishing Camp along with Seagull Resort. And Nunstead would begin Chik-Wauk. Wildwood became known as the plush resort on the trail. Oh, I'm reading some of my notes that some people can't see. Is that right?
That's right. That's right.
Oh, okay. So by 31, then Cliff Waters, Willard Waters arrive. I'll just briefly go over that because their story is amazing, and they've got there's a resource for that, but the whole water story will be for another time. But they help then working on for Russell Blankenberg and help build other places on the lake, and we'll get to some more of their story too. Okay. Wildwood again, this is what they developed down in their bay, pretty shallow area there, down at the end of the lake. And all of these places we've been to trying to see if there's still some evidence. And we'll get to some of that, but I want to jump right to some remnants of Wildwood. So I was on a website reading a blog, and people were contributing and saying there's this trapper shack down at the end of the lake. Does anybody know anything about it? And I'm curious what it is. Other people are contributing. It sounds like Wildwood Resort down there. It must be a trapper shack, blah, 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 this and that. And they were surprised at some of the debris that was left behind and so forth. And a couple of years ago, my grandson and I went down to explore. I'd never heard of a trapper shack made out of concrete. But it's that mound just off in the picture. The boathouse would have been here. The mound, concrete, doorway going in. This must have been the Wildwood root cellar. Okay. Moving on a little further, Willard Waters had his, he was another one of the brothers, had his place up on Gull Lake. Jack Miles from Minneapolis came up in the 20s for fishing and canoe trips, and eventually hired Cliff Waters to build a tent camp up on Sag. And in 1936, Jack Miles acquired the whole island for his place on Seagull. Eventually had his family cabin and the 4 other buildings there. And then Ted and Lil, Ted was a retired railroad engineer. He wanted to build a place far enough away from a railroad that he'd never hear an engine again. So he thought Seagull Lake would be a good bet. So they built up here, which was pretty close to the Grandpa Lake Portage. Okay. This was kind of interesting to me in 1934, an aerial photo, Gunflint Trail coming in to Seagull Resort. In 34, the county had already taken over, I think, this road that Blankenberg and Munstead built up to Chik-Wauk and Sag Fishing Camp, Quiet Cove Resort. Well, not quite yet, but you'll see a pencil line on this aerial photo. And if you look close, there's a loop over here. I think sometime maybe in the 40s or early 50s, that somebody was using that to plan the extension of the Gunflint Trail in the campground and the driveway into Quiet Cove. Okay. Sag Fishing Camp, you can see the road coming in here, the trail up here to Chik-Wauk. Kind of cool. Okay. And then just before World War II, Cliff Waters acquires his parcel on 3 Mile Island in 36. Quiet Cove, established in 1935. Mark and Mary Tibbetts were guests of Jimmy Dunn's down at Poplar Lake area. As part of their honeymoon is when they first came up, and Jimmy Dunn was their guide. When Jimmy Dunn moved up to Seagull, Mark and Mary came up and were guests for a number of years. And somewhere in the early 40s, I think they were able to buy a piece just across the bay, and where they built. If you're down on the lake, that's really a high hill. And at some point, they had put in a cart rail system down to the shore. Okay. During the war years, this is where I have some questions for folks. One of the resources that I had indicated Clifford, Willard Waters, and Annie's boys. Who's Annie's boys? And probably Willard and Andy are going to have to register for the draft. Clifford goes to England. He marries Hilda Hall in 45. Francis goes to Portland as a mechanic, marries Peggy in April of 44. But my resource just indicated that Danny was killed in the war in 1944. Hubert was killed in 45. And I haven't heard, these names before. So kind of curious for that piece of history and who these folks were. Okay. In the post-war years, 45, Peter and Laura Blomberg acquired a parcel down at the end next to Wildwood. Andy Mail, Ralph Skrine, and Corey Congleton helped build his place. Ralph Skrine comes up after the war and decides to stay. He acquired a piece up here. It wasn't that Andy Mayo knew about. Henry Lammers, 45, was a high school kid, a nephew of Ted and Lil's. They say you can have an acre down here if you'll build your own cabin. And it took him a few seasons to get he and his buddy coming up, harvesting the logs, learning how to build a log cabin, getting help from Cliff and other folks. In 47, Jimmy Dunn sells to Harry and Genevieve Brown. Harry's a school teacher in Duluth. So they bought his place. So now we've got all these folks involved in life on the trail. Okay. Ralph Skrine, one of his early jobs was to fix that boathouse for the Browns, take it apart, put it on footings back away from the shore so it wouldn't flood anymore. And here Ralph is working on the deck and getting that back together. Okay. And then Peter Blomberg decided to build a boathouse and a workshop, made a rough sketch on a napkin, I suppose, what he wanted, gave it to Andy Mayo. And then over the winter, Andy proceeded to build this fortress, 2 stories, concrete at the base foundation and a workshop up above. Okay. Here's Bob and Henry and the product of their work on that west shore. Next. And Rolf bought the property from Ashton and Laird, some nephews again of Carlson's. And I think he finished the cabin as opposed to starting from scratch. It sounded like the cabin was started by Ashton and Laird, and Rolf then finished that. I want you to notice this nice brown pathway. So it could be a spring, summer project where Rolf hauled in not sand, but a product called rotten rock. Does rotten rock make sense to folks? Look, there's a few places on Seagull where this deteriorating granite exists. So you can pick up a rock, crush it in your hand, and you've got good tread material. So that was mined one place, Francis Waters at Quiet Cove Resort had a big supply of that. Not much is left there. It's back down to bedrock in that area. But Rolf also pointed out that there was a couple places down by the Alpine Portage that people on the lake would go down with their boats and buckets and come back with clean tread material for their pathways. Okay. Cliff Waters, after the war, he's back on Seagull. Seagull Lake is up here. I had the opportunity to visit with Cliff a few times, and in fact, he was more retired. He and Hilda were retired in Arizona, So this is before email, right? So I write him a letter. Would you be willing to answer a few questions? And I'll send you some maps if you'd write on the maps about the history of Seagull Lake. And sure, yeah, the letter comes back. Yeah, I'll be happy to do that. Then send my letter down, and then it's months and months. And he finally sent it back, saying that in fact, this is some of his handwriting and so on. I sent him 54 questions, and he graciously answered all of those. But on the map, he had put in this route from Seagull Lake coming down, and this is his trap line. He had built a shack down on Gillis Lake. There's a bunch of leftover pieces and stuff down there that's kind of fun to go through. Cliff in the open water season would take his 13-foot Grumman and paddle down in this area, spend a few nights at his shack and go back. Otherwise it'd be by snowshoe. And he also had a route up on Seagull. Next. And I want to introduce another person. Walter McFarlane arrived on Seagull Lake, but I'd call him a short timer. He came after the war, 47. He was from out east. He and Calvin Rutstrom had traveled together and came to this area. And again, I'd like to spend a whole program on Walter. Walter was an artist by training, but he needed to get to the woods to get away from, I think, the war, and was also employed building, guiding, and the like for the few years that he was on Seagull Lake. I was able to get a photocopy. We consider this a self-portrait. Somebody wrote, I think it was Jenna Webster, somebody commented that Walter McFarlane looks like a pair of overalls hanging on a hook. Did have the opportunity to meet him before he passed away. And like I say, that's a whole nother story. Okay. And then the changes happen in the 50s. Late 48, Congress passes Tyblotnick Act to buy resorts and private lands in the wilderness in lieu of tax payments to Cook Lake, St. Louis County. Truman issues an executive order for airspace reservation and additional state regulations in 1949. Okay. So in that early 50s period, Wildwood closes. Here eventually is purchased by the Isaac Walton League, which could move faster than the federal government. The Ikes would buy properties, hold on to it until the feds had the money to buy it. Jack Miles sells to the government. Carlson's. Rutstrom had his place here. He sold Wildwood in 55. Bob and Marge Cushman dismantled Wildwood and rebuild it as the Island Lodge up at this part of the lake. Wyatt Cove is still going. Cliff and Hilda, 1955, they opened North Country Trading Post. And so those were some of the changes up to 55, okay. So 56 to the 60s, those places are gone. Brown sell to the government. They moved their rental cabins down to Poplar Lake. They also get the larger cabin from Miles and get that down. I think that was Wendigo, the original Wendigo Lodge. There were three log cabins from Miles that ended up at Wilderness Canoe Base. Ted and Lil sell their place. Cliff bought that. I think Rutstrom's cabin here, I think, was dismantled by Ralph Skrine and then used to build his outfitting building up right, same place really as North Country Trading Post. That's a story unto itself again, because Calvin Rutstrom bought that land and then leased it for these residents to build their businesses, eventually selling them the land too. Rolf and Gail sell their cabin to the government. Craig Rantala from Gull Lake buys that, dismantles it, moves it up to Gull Lake. And then by 60, Wilderness Canoe Base had acquired Quiet Cove Resort. Okay. So 1957 aerial photo. Seagull Resort, busy, going concern. Over there, the owners after Francis Waters of Quiet Cove, the Brady's and Hartshorns, I think they're the ones that put in the driveway, because now the Gunflint Trail is up, includes the campground and so forth. And you can see the driveway coming into the cove. And if you get out a magnifying glass, there's a little speck of light here in 1957. That's the first construction at Wilderness Canoe Base, their dock. Otherwise, the rest of the program was run under canvas up on the island. Okay. In the 60s, the Blombergs sell their place. Cliff Waters purchased the buildings. He donated a building to Wilderness Canoe Base, which was dismantled in 64 and brought over. The Tibbets down here, they sell, but they moved their cabin up to outside of the boundary waters. And Lammers eventually sold to the government, and I think that was the last structure in the boundary waters to be removed. Sometime in the late 70s, the new owners of Seagull Resort, the Danielsons, their son Kim, moved that. I was already living up here and had a conversation with Kim, and he asked me, what should I use, my skidder or my bulldozer to pull that cabin across the lake? And he answered his own question, which do I want to lose? But he had made an ice road all the way around 3 Mile Island and eventually pulled that cabin out. Next. If there's any questions and corrections, I'm certainly welcome to those, emailed or otherwise. And appreciate the time. A quick run through seagull growing and seagull development receding.
Bravo, thank you. We do have time for questions and comments and suggestions, so either from the peanut gallery online or those present here at the station.
When Jim, when Kim moved that building. It was a D2 cat that he got from Ernie Sitch up on Sag. And to move it, he changed a log across the blade and across the back end. So if he did break through the ice, he maybe wouldn't lose the cat.
Yeah.
His two sons rode on top of the cabin coming back. And he took two sections. There was the log structure, the original log structure. And then as Henry had kids, they added a frame section. The frame section became a laundry house at Seagull Resort. I can't remember, I think where Mike Berg is now, he had moved the log structure there for a while.
Okay. Yeah.
Jim, I have a chat question from Nancy Baker. First, she says, great presentation. Thanks, Jim. Can you tell us more about Mr. McFarlane?
There's a whole story. I was, he found out about the North Woods reading Hudson Bay Company's magazine in the trenches in Europe that had an article written by Calvin Rutstrom, who had already traveled up in this area. And they started to communicate. And in '47, they met in Thunder Bay and did a long canoe trip. Eventually, Walter ends up on Seagull. His artwork is beautiful. It really depicts the boreal forest and the indigenous people in this area. I've only seen a few pieces. I don't know. I've tried finding more of his work. He commissioned pieces for financial institutions out east. He sold pieces to Les Cuba's gallery in the cities. And even following up on all of that, still couldn't find any. When I visited him in Sioux Lookout, I went to the library because nobody was telling me where he lived. Went to the library, and behind the library desk was a painting, huge, of a Northwood scene, one of his more famous ones, which shows up in some other magazines. But not wanting to give away the whole story, he and Calvin Rutstrom are ruminating in early 50s at Calvin's cabin on 3 Mile Island. And according to the story, there's too much boat traffic, too many, even seeing water skiers go by. This isn't what we bought into. Where can we go? Walter suggests Sioux Lookout, Ontario. Calvin Rutstrom says, when should we go? Walter says, let's go now. And they pack up Calvin's station wagon, and away they went that night. But anyway, that's just kind of part of Walter McFarlane's background. I did also online, amazing what online does. I started to communicate with a gentleman out in New York, and his father and family got to know Walter as a guide up in Sioux Lookout, and even traveled between their homes. And this gentleman in New York wants to learn more as well. He has a box full of correspondence with Walter.
I have a question from Peter. Nicola, where did the late evergreen building cabin at Wilderness Canoe Base come from?
Okay, I'll try to be brief. All the buildings at Wilderness were named, they didn't have numbers. So Evergreen was a 5-room log building that was acquired at auction in Ely in 58, 59. There were a number of resorts on Basswood Lake that were bought by the government and auctioned off. The Wilderness was just starting, remember, under canvas in 57. By 59, they had acquired 8 log buildings from Basswood Lake. So 20 miles by road, well, almost 20 by road out of Ely to get to Fall Lake by ice road, 20 miles to get to Pipestone and Jackfish Bay. Evergreen was a resort over there, so the name stayed. Evergreen dismantled, brought over, and rebuilt on the West Island, if you remember on the map. Yeah, and there's more to that too, but yeah. Hi, Peter. Hi, Nancy. Hi, Katie.
Anyone else have questions on Zoom? You can unmute yourself or put it in chat.
Was there a lot of pushback of the BWCA coming in on Seagull
All the time.
all the time?
Yeah, it was hard. It was hard for people, places that they put blood, sweat, and tears into to see it go. I think Russell kind of insulated himself, Mr. Blankenberg. He had about 100 parcels all over the place, and happened to be on the shore of Seagull with the sand beach, and that was let's see, that was one slice of bread of his bread and butter. But I was curious about the 2 islands, Fishhook and Dominion, were acquired from Russell Blankenberg. Where did Russell get them from? Huh? Well, it turns out he had property on Knife Lake and Basswood Lake, and rather than sell to the government, he exchanged for those 2 parcels, Fishhook and what we call Dominion, and then also another piece on Mayhew Lake.
Are there other questions or other comments? I see.
Are there any monuments or markers at the locations of these original buildings? Still there? Stone or brass or anything?
No, what I found at Wildwood is a car battery and the root cellar. There might be some footings. There's footings and concrete steps at Jimmy Dunn's Camp Wendigo. There's some of that down there. Blomberg's place was pretty well cleaned up, and that's a story on its own. You saw that concrete? That took a lot of dynamite by the Smith family. They worked for the Forest Service to blow that thing up and get it hauled out onto the lake and dumped, is what I think. Rutstrom's, there's some footings and a can and bottle dump, which was the practice in those days. Go out back. Some places you can still find a outhouse or outhouse pieces. After the Alpine Lake fire, if you remember Blomberg's and Wildwood, behind or just north of Wildwood, when I drove past on the lake after the Alpine Lake fire, which burned that whole area over, back up on the hill were shelving units and refrigerator and some other stuff that I could see up there. So it's not the brass monument that we would like to have, but there is some evidence. Jim?
Somebody made with you, there's the CCC did some work up around Seagull Lake, you know, about that.
Yeah. They were all over. They did an amazing job on portage work and big, huge log landings, put logs out into the lake, fill them with rock, borrow pits to bring gravel. All the portages from Seagull down to Chik-Wauk had these landings. If you want to bring that yellow map back up, that was a big part of it. They planted trees. The CCC camp is where the Seagull Guard Station is now. That was the closest CCC camp up here. Yeah, the evidence was there, but over time it deteriorates and so on. You can't see it on this map. Yeah, I can, right here. There's a little dotted line that goes back from Paulson Lake to Jimmy Lake. And that just piqued my curiosity for years because all the portages have the same kind of dotted lines and trails. And eventually getting out there and realizing, well, yeah, out in the middle of nowhere, here's this path. And the path, it had blaze marks on the trees. And those first years, it was just a joy to follow that and Cliffwater's route back to Seagull. And over the years, it's grown over in the lake. But that particular trail, at one point I got confused because I walked into a wall of balsam growing yay wide. And I had the trail back there, but it wasn't in front of me until I got down on my hands and knees and looked underneath the balsam. And sure enough, they were growing in the tread of the trail. And on the side of that tread was riprap rock, which was not natural. That had to be put in by people to make the tread. And yeah, so I think that was the one I was talking to you about, specifically CCC evidence.